U.S. This is Cold War era, people. Queen Elizabeth II was crowned on June 2nd, and in 1953, Helen Roseveare joined the Worldwide Evangelization Crusade, the WEC, and was sent as a medical missionary to what was then the Belgian Congo. So now we'll backtrack and go back to her beginning. She was born on September 21st, 1925 in Hertfordshire, England, kind of near London, just east of London. She grew up in a Christian family that instilled in her a strong sense of faith. She described it as Anglo-Catholic, which is a very liturgical style Anglican. The priest was there, and you would stand up, sit down, repeat what the priest was saying. And she says that she never really understood the gospel, but her family was very faithful to go to this Anglo-Catholic church. And she also was a very good student. She tells a story in the church of going, she was 8 years old, and the priest was saying the word oblation. We're giving oblation to God. And afterwards, she turns to her mom and says, what is oblation? And her mom kind of brushes her off, gives her some answer that she doesn't really know. And later she found out oblation is giving worship to God. They often used it with the Eucharist, but these people were often just repeating what the priest was saying without ever really knowing what was being said, ever really changing their heart. She says that as a 12-year-old girl, she was confirmed in her Anglo-Catholic church, and it was kind of a check in the religious box. The gospel hadn't yet penetrated her heart. But like I said, she was a good student, and even in the 30s and 40s, her family encouraged her to do well in school. She was very interested in math and science. She was a good student, got straight A's, and was even going to university. This is now 1944. Of course, this is wartime in London, and she talks about enemy planes coming over. Of course, there were bomb scares. The siren would ring out, and you would have to go to the bomb shelter to be safe. And she talks about just kind of being tired of it, and you would see the enemy plane go by. You'd hear the bomb alarms going off, but you just kind of stand there, kind of fascinated in awe, but just kind of tired of the war, and you would be glad when the bomb dropped somewhere else, which is a very scary place to be. But she went to college thinking, I'm going to keep God separate. I'm going to study medicine. I want to be a doctor, but I'm going to keep God separate. He might still be there. I'm not going to give up on him entirely, but we'll see. We'll see. I'm not quite sure. And she went to her dorm for the first time, kind of dropped all her stuff off in this new dorm room, alone. It's college for the first time. And she sees a little note by her mirror that says, "Hi, I'm so-and-so. I'd like to invite you to tea in my room at 8 o'clock tonight after you get settled in." And she says tears just kind of came to her eyes, that she thought, wow, someone's going out of their way to invite me, to try and be friends with me. So she went, and she says those girls were so impactful on her life. They were Christian girls. She did not go there to be involved in all this Christian stuff, but she became friends with these girls. She saw how joyful they were, their happiness, their kind and compassionate attitude towards her, and she decided to be friends with them and maybe even dive more into this Christian world. And so she went to, I said Cambridge. This is specifically Newnham College, which is one of the colleges at Cambridge. And a fun fact that I saw was that Cambridge was an all-boys school up until 1948, which was when she was there, when Newnham College, which was an all-girls school, became a part of Cambridge. And so she graduated from Newnham College, which is a part of Cambridge University, along with Jane Goodall and Emma Thompson, which was very interesting. But so she befriended these Christian girls, and she would go to their Christian meetings and Bible studies, and she really just devoured the Word of God. She couldn't get enough of it. She was so impressed by all that these girls knew. They loved their Bible, and they knew all these Bible stories and Bible verses. And she was saying that her first year there, she was going to go home for Christmas break, as many college students do, but her sister had smallpox, and Helen had had measles or mumps or something as a child and handled it really poorly. And so her family said, your sister has smallpox, why don't you stay at college for Christmas and not come home this year? So Helen stayed her first Christmas away from her family, although she had grown up in boarding school, but I imagine she went to home for Christmas. And this is God's providence. There was a Christian conference there, winter conference there at Cambridge. And she says these Christian girls, they took her to a conference to hear solid biblical teaching. And after that, in the dorm where she was staying, she prayed to God to make himself known to her. There were, and are, if you go to Cambridge, Bible verses just painted on the walls. It's a historically Christian school, not so much Christian anymore, but Bible verses painted on the walls. And she says, it was wartime and the roof had leaked away, the last word painted on the wall, but it said, be still and know that I am. There, she says, it all made sense. She felt an overwhelming feeling of God's love and that she may have the forgiveness of her sins because of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. This, she says, was also her missionary call. She knew from that moment on that she wanted to share Jesus with others. So the leader of this conference knew that she had now become a Christian. She was so excited about the gospel that Jesus could forgive her of her sins, and she was becoming excited to share Jesus with others. The leader of the conference gave her a Bible, which she says she had never owned a Bible before, and he wrote in the cover Philippians 3:10, which says, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and may share his sufferings, becoming like him in death. And she didn't know it then, but this verse would become a very powerful verse that Roseveare would lean on again and again. And so Helen spent many years at university. She graduated as a medical doctor, and she went to the WEC, Worldwide Evangelization Crusade, their training center, and worked on campus as a missionary candidate. She knew she wanted to be a missionary, but they don't just send you out right away willy-nilly. You go to the training center, and she lived there for 5 years, training to be a missionary. Now, remember I said she went to boarding school. So she says this was the first time she had ever done chores. They put her in the laundry, and then they moved her to the kitchen. She said the men complained, and so they moved her back to the laundry. But I don't know if this was financial or just intentional, but they had old school laundry there where it was a big tank and you would crank it and there was boiling water on the bottom. So she says she did the laundry, but read, that's boil, crank, scrub, wring out. And she says that her and her partner became a good team at doing the laundry. She says that her partner would wring out the clothes onto Helen's outstretched legs while Helen was reading aloud some theological book. So how much did she learn? I don't know. But they were a good team. And of course, the rudimentary, laundry, I'm sure, helped her in the future going to Africa. She went to the WEC, worked on campus, and then in 1953, at the age of 28, she joined officially as a missionary at the WEC and was sent as a medical missionary to the Belgian Congo. And you'll see in your handout there's a map of Congo where it is. She said she wasn't sure where she wanted to go. She was open to many places, and the WEC even had their hand in many places. They had missionaries all around the world. But a couple had come back on furlough and went to the WEC headquarters in London and were telling all about the Congolese people and the work that God was doing there, but also they mentioned their need for a doctor. And Helen thought, well, that's exactly what I've been trained to do. I think that God is wanting me to go to Congo. And a few events happened. Bible verses kept being shared with her. The same Bible verses kept being shared with her. And she felt certain, God is calling me to the Congo. Now, Congo, I'm going to give you some stats on Congo. It is the second largest country in Africa after Algeria, which my husband Matthew was asking me, okay, so tell me, like, what does that mean? So he helped me look it up. It's the size of Alaska and Texas combined, Algeria, or Congo. So it's fairly big. It's rich in resources like diamonds, gold, coltan, which is used for cell phones and electronics, cobalt, copper, uranium. But despite Congo being so large and being rich in so many natural resources, they're actually a very poor nation because of mainly centuries, decades, possibly even centuries of war, and political corruption, and of course, sin. It's a large country, but still very, very impoverished. So she, just like Mary Slessor, she went on the very long boat trip down to Africa. And I loved what even you said about the bread, the crust, having outside influences from the world, and then in the middle kind of being a little bit of an unknown place. I think that Helen would probably agree with that, because she says that she took, of course, a boat to Africa, but then took a train down to very much the heart of Africa, Central Africa. And you could see out your window the different just vast landscapes changing before your eyes. And of course, Congo has in the north a giant rainforest, and that's kind of where she was, in the northeast of Congo. And she had been trained as a medical doctor. And so when she went there, she went to what was a medical center there. There was a doctor there who was training her. And then after 2 years, she went 7 miles away to another village called Nibabongo. And that is where she they built their own hospital and medical center. It was challenging conditions with limited resources. There was no electricity, and they had to improvise drip lines and baby formula. And people were brought in from over 200 miles away to receive care from Dr. Helen and her team. She says that she tells a story about the malaria patients, which malaria was, of course, in Mary's life too, the malaria patients in the Congo, versus her medical training and what the textbook back in England prescribed to do, that you take a swab, you put it under the microscope, you have to wait like 40 minutes for it to culture and then view it, and then you make the diagnosis. Well, she said, we didn't have time for that. We didn't have electricity. All of this would have to be done during the daytime. We saw like 200 patients a day. We didn't have time to look under the microscope for everything, so we had to make our best educated guesses and go from there. And she says that most of the patients did respond well to the treatment at first, even without exactly what the textbook was prescribing them to do. And now, if you'll allow me, I'm going to actually read a few excerpts from some of her books, which are very good. I encourage you to read them. And this one is Faithful Women and Their Extraordinary God by Noel Piper. And I'm going to read just a small page from 152. So this is about starting in the Congo. She says, starting with nothing but an upturned tea chest, a camp table and stool, a Primus stove and saucepan, I discovered what it was to be fenced in with difficulties. So much that should have been done to maintain medical standards just proved impossible. Good training told me that a patient with a high fever and chills, painful eyes, and profuse sweating was probably suffering from malaria. Treatment was quinine in a suitable dose according to the weight of the patient, but only after the diagnosis had been confirmed in the laboratory. This microscopic procedure would take a well-trained technician at least 5 minutes, with 50 or more patients daily showing symptoms of malaria. This would have added over 4 hours to the day's work. With no electricity, these 4 hours would have to be during daytime. Yet besides these 50 malarial patients, there were probably 150 others with other complaints. The day simply wasn't long enough, and so malarial symptoms prompted treatment with quinine, a quick estimate of weight, and no laboratory confirmation. While I began to realize that over 200 patients were being treated daily, and 75% or more were responding immediately to the initial treatment given, I began to see that it was not necessarily a lowering of standards to treat malarial symptoms without laboratory confirmation. Rather, it was a necessary adaptation to circumstances. These same 200 patients daily, having received something that aided their physical pain to subside, were then much more open to listen to the preaching of the gospel. So what she had was a medical center, but she had a local church that she partnered with, and they would come and they would pray with and pray for and share the gospel with each and every patient that was seen. And so she talks about just how hard it was, the physical toll of seeing 200 patients in a day with limited resources and feeling pretty down about that. But the people from the church would say, people come to see you. And because you're here, you're the doctor, we get to share the gospel and pray with all of these people. And so not only did she was the doctor there, but she had to do so many other tasks. I told you they moved her 7 miles away to a new village, Nebo Bongo. And she said that she was there for 10 years. Helen, her nursing students, and the training program moved with her. Not only did she help to found the hospital, but she helped to build it literally. And this is what she said that her and her colleague Florence Stebbing had to learn to do. Make bricks, fire a brick kiln, work a spirit level, mix cement and sand for concrete, fell trees, saw planks, raise roof trusses, install asbestos sheeting. Now you don't do that. But they also had a truck that was ambulance / builder's truck / food van, and they had to learn the mechanics from the van just by trial and error. And so she did much more than being a medical doctor in Africa. When you're a missionary, you also are doing all these other things too. She said she prayed often for God to send helpers and often asked God why he didn't send a man instead to build the buildings so she could focus on the medical side. After all, she was still seeing patients even while constructing the building. But a team of locals provided help, and she says, I soon discovered that they work much better if you work with them. And even though Helen left everything behind to come to Africa and minister to the people there, it was hard to overcome the cultural and the racial gap. Many locals didn't trust the white Europeans or didn't trust that other Africans could provide as good of medical care. Working with her hands in the grime to build a hospital gave her camaraderie with the locals and built up trust with them. And after a year, the hospital building was completed. But still, it seemed like the demands wouldn't let up. I'll do another one here. She said, my complaint was reversed. The hospital was built and functioning, and the news had gone round, and patients began streaming in. I had not time for anything but medicine, medicine, medicine. There was no let up. There was no off-duty. I had hoped to be a good missionary, to be able to sit by bedsides and tell the good news of salvation. But there was time for nothing but medicine. Again, fortunately, I took my problem to the church elders for their prayers. Again, they not only prayed for and comforted me, but also graciously rebuked me. Doctor, how many patients come to this hospital daily? About 200 to 250. Surely they come because you are here. They wouldn't come if there was no doctor. And what are we doing? All day, every day, wherever you go, we go. Doctor, do you realize we are having the joy of leading 5, 10, sometimes even more people to the Lord every week? If you weren't here, they wouldn't come. She says, God had to teach me to be willing to be a member of a team. Her work extended beyond providing immediate medical care. She was deeply committed to training the local healthcare workers, ensuring that the communities could sustain their healthcare needs independently. So she was trying to train the Africans there to be able to be the nurses and to be the help in the hospital, so that maybe one day, if she wasn't there, they could help the hospital to keep going. She talks about actually having a training school and training these nurses, and she had, of course, her English medicine textbook, but her and her helper, they helped to translate the entire textbook into Swahili. And so they not only translated the entire textbook into Swahili, but they old school printed every page, page by page with ink, and then you have to leave each page out to dry. And she says more than once, the wind came in and flew all the pages up in the air and caused a huge disorder. But she worked hard in that aspect too of training the locals. And then came the year 1960. On July 30th, 1960, Belgium granted independence to the Belgian Congo. Belgian was dropped from the name, and it became the Democratic Republic of Congo. It was called Zaire for a little bit in the 70s, but we'll just call it Congo. Belgium left, but was still involved in Congo. Now, remember I told you they're rich in so many natural resources, and so not only was Belgium, they left, but their officials maybe even still there. Who else was there was the U.S. and the USSR had their fingers in Belgium because they were trying to get the uranium to make the atomic bombs. This is Cold War era. In fact, I listened to a whole podcast on the Billy Joel song, We Didn't Start the Fire, about the Belgians in the Congo, and yes, it's called the Congo Crisis, and it was very devastating. It lasted from 1960 to 1965, and that's while she was still there. The political instability and violence that erupted during this time posed significant risks to Helen and her colleagues. Now, despite the dangers, Helen remained steadfast in her commitment to her mission, providing care to those in need and supporting her fellow missionaries. And during this time of changeover, non-Africans, and what's cool about Helen is she's kind of more modern, and you can see interviews of her on YouTube. And so when I watched some of the interviews, she'd always go, the pale skins, with her hand. But she would say that during this time of the political instability, the pale skins basically all left. There were very few people remaining there that were from Europe or America or wherever. And she says that even for a long time, she was the only white person in the entire village of Nebo Bongo. She was so committed to her calling that she decided it was worth it to stay. And not only was it the Congo crisis, the whole country is in this new political, not sure what they're going to do. A civil war broke out. The new president and the new prime minister did not get along. Their policies were different. And they had their own armies, basically, that followed them, and there was a political civil war. Now, her and her village, she was still relatively unaffected. I mean, that might be an overstatement. They came in, she says, they basically took whatever was takeable, but they hadn't yet touched her. She was still able to live there. She was the doctor, and they very much respected that. But she does say that the rebels wrought havoc, destroying property, stealing possessions, inflicting cruelties, instilling fear. The shops emptied of all stores, all work ceased, and the economy crumbled. Good men were murdered, many others tortured and mutilated. All sense of order and discipline disappeared, and anarchy took over. So an already impoverished country was now in a brutal civil war. The limited staff, food, and resources now became even more limited. And over the radio, they heard rumblings of the guerrilla army coming in and inflicting terror and chaos. But Helen says, whenever we could, we met together to pray and read the word of God and sing his praises. And so we kept sane. And God graciously replaced fear with peace. So there was still little food and medicine, but still patients came to be seen. And her ministry team of locals would share the gospel with each person who came. Each patient was prayed for and prayed with. And she tells the story of a little boy named Paul. Next to the medical center, there was a school for the orphans, and it was started by missionaries. The missionaries, I don't think, were there anymore, but the school was still going on. And there's a little boy named Paul, and he was 9 years old. And whenever they heard trucks coming into the village, because by this time the rebels had taken all the trucks, if you heard a truck, you know it was bad. And so if they heard a truck coming, they would sound the alarm, and there was a monitor for each class. And so the monitor would basically take the classroom apart, make it look like no one had been there for a long time, while the teacher and the rest of the students would go out into the forest. And then the monitor, when he was done, he would race to the forest as well. Little Paul was 9. The trucks were coming in. The alarm was going off. He had picked up all of the notebooks, erased the blackboard. She said that he was on the chairs trying to take down the pinned posters. And he saw the other monitors running to the forest, and he realized he was too late. And so the soldiers, they found him, they beat him, questioned him, wanting to know where the other people had gone, because the soldiers were looking for teenage boys to bring into their ranks. Of course, the teenage boys would usually never be seen again. The soldiers believed that if a bullet went towards them, it would turn to liquid as it reached them. So the soldiers really believed that they were unhurtable. Now, Paul remembered a story of a little boy who was a deaf mute. He pretended to be a deaf mute, and he says, Paul later told Helen that he was reminding himself that Jesus loved me so much that he died for me, and so I could go through anything they did to me for his sake, which is incredible for a 9-year-old boy. This book is called Holiness by J.C. Ryle. If you've not read it, I recommend it. It's very good. And in it, just thinking about war, this is from the chapter called The Fight. He says, all worldly war is more or less evil. No doubt it is an absolute necessity in many cases to procure the liberty of nations, to prevent the weak from being trampled down by the strong, but still war is an evil. It entails a dreadful amount of bloodshed and suffering. It hurries into eternity myriads who are completely unprepared for their change. It calls forth the worst passions of man. It causes enormous waste and destruction of property. It fills peaceful homes with mourning widows and orphans. It spreads poverty, taxation, and national distress far and wide. It disarranges all the order of society. It interrupts the work of the gospel and the growth of Christian missions. And in short, war is an immense and incalculable evil. And every praying man should cry night and day, give peace in our times. Well, war was exactly what was surrounding Helen at this time. And she says that early August, on a Saturday afternoon in 1964, she says that her village was suddenly and without much warning at war. The guerrilla soldiers came in one night during the Simba Rebellion. She says she doesn't even know what time, because by that time they had taken anything takeable, their clocks and watches and anything else. And the Simba Rebellion was just a regional uprising where she was, that took place within the scope of the Congo crisis and the Cold War. Helen was captured. She was beaten. She said her teeth were, some of her back teeth were knocked out, held captive for 5 months. And during that time, she and other women were taken into captivity in a holding room, and they were abused. And the night she was captured, she said she felt abandoned by God. She was reminded of that same verse that was written in her Bible so many years ago, Philippians 3, and being called to the fellowship of Christ's sufferings. She felt like God was reminding her that they were not attacking her, they were attacking him. He was just using her body to show himself to the people around her. If our bodies truly are a living sacrifice to God, then it doesn't matter how much our physical bodies are hurt. What matters is God being glorified in our bodies, no matter the cost. She says that during this time, 27 brother missionaries were murdered. Probably that 27, of course, is awful, but also most missionaries had left, and so that's probably even of the remnant that were still there. She said over 200 nuns were murdered. There were also some Catholic missions there, countless priests, and by one estimation I saw online, 100,000 Africans lost their lives. And I think this is the book that is out in the hall, Living a Sacrifice. Helen not only had an incredible life, but she's an incredible storyteller. Her book is very well written, and thanks to my husband, I actually took an afternoon and read the whole thing in one day. He watched the boys. But I'll just read this little part here. She says, for 20 years, anything I had needed, I had asked of God, and he provided. Now, this night, the Almighty had stooped to ask of me something that he condescended to appear to need, and he offered me the privilege of responding. He wanted my body in which to live and through which to love these very rebel soldiers in the height of their wickedness. It was inconceivable yet true. He offered me the inestimable privilege of sharing with him in some little measure, at least in the edge of the fellowship of his sufferings, and it was all privilege. And J.C. Ryle says, He who has the most faith will always be the happiest and most comfortable soldier. Nothing makes the anxieties of warfare sit so lightly on a man as the assurance of Christ's love and continual protection. Nothing enables him to bear the fatigue of watching, struggling, and wrestling against sin like the confidence that the indwelling Christ is on his side and success is sure. It is the shield of faith which quenches all the fiery darts of the wicked one. It is the man who can say, I know whom I have believed, who can say in a time of suffering, I have no cause for shame. He who wrote those glowing words, therefore we do not lose heart, our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all, was the man who also wrote, so we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. It is the man who said, I live by faith in the Son of God, who said in the same epistle, the world has been crucified to me, and I to the world. It is the man who said, to me to live is Christ, who said in the same epistle, I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances, and I can do all this through him who gives me strength. The more faith, the more victory. The more faith, the more inward peace. So in 1965, after 5 months in captivity, Helen and others were rescued by the National Army, and Helen returned to England to recover. But her passion for the Congolese people and her mission remained undiminished. She remembered her colleagues who did not live to return home to their countries. She returned to Congo, which was Zaire at this time, in 1966, continuing her work until 1973. Her return was marked by a renewed focus on training local medical personnel and ensuring the long-term sustainability of the healthcare facilities she had established. Though Congo today is still one of the poorest countries in the world, despite it having an abundance of natural resources, since its independence in 1960, the Democratic Republic of Congo has been almost continuously at war. And I don't know if you remember this, in February of this year, 60 Christians were rounded up and killed in a church in Congo. 70, I wrote. 60 or 70, large number. In 1987, Helen went back to, and she's in England, and she was reflecting on this story. And I'm going to tell it to you instead of read it, but she was reflecting on a time when she was in Africa. She was by the roadside, and a Ugandan man came, and he asked her, are you a sent one? And she decided, I guess I am. I guess I'll say yes. I guess I'm here to tell him about Jesus. And she said, can you read? And he said no. And so she got out a wordless book, and I've made my own for you today. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but C.S. Lewis, or Spurgeon, is it C.S. Spurgeon? Charles Spurgeon. He created this in the 1800s, and it's often used with children. In fact, I think that's how he created it to be. But here's this Ugandan man. He can't read, and so she pulls out her wordless book, and she begins to go through the gospel with him, that God has made us to be in perfect communion with him, that he is glorious and perfect, but that sin has entered the world, and we are all broken. And we can't be in relationship with God because we are sinful, and God cannot be around sinful people. But God loves us so much that he made a way for us, and Jesus died on the cross so that we could be made right with God. And if we believe on the Lord Jesus, you will be saved, and God makes our sins that were scarlet as white as snow, and we even can get to grow in fellowship with him as we live our life. And one day, we even get to be in glory with him. And so she went through the wordless book with him, and she said, years later, I was in England, and I was waiting for a train, and there was a woman next to me, and it was raining. She didn't have an umbrella, so I offered to share mine with her. She said, I was just looking for a way into a conversation with her instead of it being awkward holding the umbrella for both of us. And so she commented on the advertisement across the street. She said, it just makes me so mad. These cigarette advertisements make people want to smoke. And the woman started crying, and she said, I've just come from the doctor where they told me that I'm dying from lung cancer because I've smoked my whole life. And she said, well, God just was leading my conversation right there, I pulled out the same wordless book, and I went through the entire gospel with her. And she said, "True, I blushed from ear to ear because the whole compartment listened in while I shared with her the exact same way of salvation that I had taught an illiterate herdsman on the African roadside. There was no difference. It didn't matter whether I traveled 6,000 miles or just 20 minutes from home. What matters is whether the people we meet matter to us as much as they matter to God." So we're going to conclude, and I have a few questions, similar to how Haley had some questions at the end. Just some questions that I was reflecting on from reading her story. One, had God the right to demand of Helen all that she went through? And two, is there always a cost to following Jesus? Would I be willing to count the cost? And then I had to sit down and think, what are my costs? And I had to think about that, and I thought, well, I've given up my job to be home with my boys, to be able to raise them and share the gospel with them. Hopefully they're raised in a Christian home where they love Jesus. I've had to give up maybe the ease of having two-income family where we can maybe do a bunch of things. Silly things compared with Helen, really. But the last question that I thought about, would it have been best for Helen if she had left with the other missionaries in 1964? She would have escaped rape, arrest, mistreatment, being held at gunpoint. But she lived her life as a living sacrifice. Her body was being used by God, and afterwards she was willing to relate to and comfort the other captured women. The hard years of being a village doctor with inadequate supplies to help, but the gospel was shared with each patient. Didn't many come to know Jesus just because they were there to see her, the doctor? So there is always a cost to following Jesus. And I'm going to read a little bit from Holiness again. This is the chapter called The Cost. He says, "Think, if you want stirring motives for serving God, what it cost to provide a salvation for your soul. Think how the Son of God left heaven and became man, suffered on the cross and lay in the grave to pay your sin debt to God and work out for you a complete redemption. Think of all this and learn that it is no light matter to possess an immortal soul. It is worthwhile to take some trouble about one's soul. Ah, lazy man or woman, has it really come to this, that you will miss heaven for lack of trouble? Are you really determined to make shipwreck forever from mere dislike to exertion? Away with the cowardly, unworthy thought. Arise and play the man. Say to yourself, whatever it may cost, I will, at any rate, strive to enter in at the small gate. Look at the cross of Christ and take fresh courage. Look forward to death, judgment, and eternity, and be in earnest. It may cost much to be a Christian, but you may be sure it pays." And I think we have maybe a couple minutes. I brought a rose from my garden, and I think Helen really liked this picture because I think she used it a couple of times. And I'm going to see if I can do it justice. But Helen would take a rose, and she would talk about, of course, the beautiful flower. It's a very well-known flower, the rose. Mine is I think it's called a China rose. It kind of spreads out. But it's the most beautiful flower with vibrant petals and a strong stem. But say God decided to prune this flower. We can take off the pretty petals and all of the heads that kind of jut out. And then you kind of take off the leaves, the good parts, and maybe even the bad parts. Maybe God is pruning you, even though you don't think you should maybe be pruned like that. But God is sovereign. And then, of course, God is wanting to get rid of the sin in our lives. And so all the thorns can get pruned away. And maybe God is whittling an arrow to make it suitable for flight. The bright flowers and leaves were sacrificed to help the arrow to fly straight, and from the destructive process, the polished shaft of an arrow was made. The arrow became a tool usable in his hands for the furtherance of his purposes. And perhaps God does this with us. He may prune away the bad and even what we think are nice things, but God has called us to be a living sacrifice. And Helen said, "It is a privilege to get to serve him or to suffer for him." And so I'll close with these verses that were inscribed on her Bible, but I'll do a little bit more than just verse 10. Philippians 3, 7 through 11 says, "But whatever things were gained to me, these things I have counted as loss because of Christ. More than that, I count all things to be loss in the view of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of many things, and count them mere rubbish, so that I may gain Christ and may be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own derived from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness which comes from God on the basis of faith, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death, if somehow I may attain to the resurrection from the dead." May this be our prayer as it was for Helen.